Hey guys, did you know that at Versailles, over 100 people once stood in a single room just to watch one man wake up? Not to speak, not to touch, just to witness the royal act of opening one's eyes. Let's dim the lights, turn on the fan, and begin with a soft hum, as always. If you're new here, feel free to subscribe, only if you actually enjoy what I do. And let me know in the comments what time it is, and where in the world you're tuning in from. It's always comforting to know who's falling asleep beside me, at least digitally. Now then, tonight we enter a world where your job is to wake up long before dawn, just to fluff someone else's pillow without ever daring to sit on it. A world where your entire day revolved around a man who rose at 8:30 a.m., but still made you feel late for work at 4:45. Welcome to the Palace of Versailles, where the floors gleamed, the walls whispered, and the servants did not sleep. It begins with silence. Not peace, just the kind of silence that clings to stone before the day exhales. At precisely 4:45 in the morning, the palace begins to stir, not from slumber, but from duty. Because here, no one truly rests. Servants rouse themselves in corridors too narrow to stretch in, from beds that are often just folded wool blankets tucked beside the warmth of the kitchen stove. If they were lucky enough to sleep indoors, the Sun King, Louis XIV, the most luminous man alive, would not rise for nearly 4 more hours. And yet the palace must already begin its preparations for the choreography of his awakening. Not just breakfast, not just clothing, but ceremony. Everything, even the act of opening one's eyes, had become a performance. By 5 a.m., the first of the undervalets enter the king's chamber. Not to wake him, heaven forbid, but to check the temperature of the room, adjust the drapes, and make sure no one has stolen the royal slippers. These were real concerns. The palace was enormous, decadent, and slightly porous when it came to things like security, privacy, or preventing theft of silver spoons. Not to mention the occasional brush with assassination. Because nothing screams morning routine like peeking under the bed for political enemies. Downstairs, the scullery maids begin scrubbing the stone floors of the servant corridors. With cold water, rough brushes, and hands that will chafe long before the sun rises. They have their own rituals. Simple, brutal, and without applause. A scratch of fire in the stove. The slow ache of copper pots hauled from hooks. And the whispered curse when someone realizes the milk delivery is late again. Because even in a palace with 700 rooms and 2,000 windows, you still need cream for coffee. Just not your coffee. That was for the king, the queen, and whichever Whig gentleman had political favor that week. By 6 a.m., more doors open. Footmen, still yawning behind their gloves, begin preparing the king's breakfast room. They are not permitted to yawn. They do it anyway, quietly. This was the strange theater of Versailles, where every action, no matter how mundane, was choreographed. Wooden floors had to be polished with beeswax and vinegar before the king stepped across them. The hallway was swept not once, but 3 times, by different tiers of servants, each ranked according to their proximity to royal toes. The closer you got to His Majesty's person, the more powerful you were. Unless you slipped on your way in, then you were unemployed. Around 7 o'clock, the palace begins to warm. Not from the weather, this is France, and winter in marble is cruel, but from the energy of expectation, because at 8:30, the king will awaken, and over 100 people will be there to watch it happen. Yes, You heard that correctly. The royal lever, or waking, was a public ceremony. Nobles competed fiercely for the privilege of watching the king yawn. It was considered the height of honor to hand him his robe, even higher, to present him with his freshly embroidered slippers. But the servants? They were invisible. They'd already lit the fire, set out the slippers, warmed the robe, and were now quietly backing out of the room before the aristocracy stumbled in, half drunk on power and perfume. There was a hierarchy even among shadows. At the bottom, the kitchen boys, the water fetchers, the candle trimmers, young, underpaid, and frequently slapped. Above them, the footmen, the pages, the laundresses, slightly better rooms, slightly fewer bruises, but still expected to smile as they passed nobles in the hallway, without ever making eye contact. And then there were the valets de chambre, men whose sole purpose was to handle the king's personal needs, to dry his back after a bath, to tuck his sleeves, to whisper reminders about who was in favor and who was not. Their job required silence, tact, and an understanding of politics that rivaled most cabinet ministers. Because if you handed the king the wrong wig, you might just ruin a treaty. Not all duties were so refined. The palace was a machine of glamour and grime, and someone had to manage the latter. Dozens of servants were employed just to carry chamber pots from one wing to another. Versailles had no indoor plumbing in its early days, only ambition, and the result was a daily relay race of human waste carried in discreet vessels down narrow servant staircases that still stank of mold and rotting linen. If you were very unlucky, your job was to clean the royal commode, a throne of porcelain, gold-trimmed, and deeply unfortunate. It was used by the king and sometimes discussed in court diaries with alarming frequency. To be the royal chamber pot bearer was considered a privilege, which tells you something about how twisted the honor system had become. Meanwhile, outside the king's bedroom, the crowd was forming. Nobles with powdered wigs and sharpened smiles waited to be seen, not by the people, not by the press, but by each other. Every nod in that hallway could win a pension. Every whisper could ruin a rival. But behind them, hidden by the drapery, the servant who swept that floor had no name anyone remembered. She would be gone before the music started, before the first violin note announced the monarch's presence, before the gold doors opened and Versailles became Versailles again. This was life inside the palace for a servant. To rise before the sun, to prepare a morning you'd never be part of, to create beauty you could not enjoy, and to vanish like a ghost when the show began. The palace didn't see you, but it needed you. Your hands shaped the day. Your feet cleaned the path. Your silence was the bedrock of everything. But if you stumbled once, you were replaceable. Like wax on the floor. Shiny, essential, and invisible. So when the clock struck 8:30 and the curtains pulled back, the nobles stepped forward with smiles. The courtiers bowed, and the king yawned. But somewhere behind the paneling, a maid wiped sweat from her brow and moved on to fluff the queen's pillow. She would never sit on it, but she would die knowing how soft it was. Let's start with a truth. No one whispered in the corridors of Versailles. You could spend your entire life inside a palace and never touch anything beautiful. Not the silk, not the velvet, not the gold, especially not the gold. Tonight, we walk through the palace not as guests, not as nobles, but as the hands that dusted the chandeliers, the ones who polished mirrors they were never allowed to look into. because for all its splendor, Versailles had a secret. The more lavish the surface, the more miserable the people underneath it. The numbers still boggle the modern mind. Over 700 rooms, more than 2,000 windows, 350 living fountains, which, let's be honest, were really just an elaborate way of saying, we're very thirsty for attention. And within that gilded labyrinth, nearly 3,000 servants worked each day. Only a fraction of them were ever seen. The rest lived in what you might call Versailles' underbelly. Not underground exactly, but hidden all the same, behind false walls, above the rafters, beneath the grand apartments, small, airless rooms where sunlight came only in slivers and ceilings were so low you learned to stoop permanently. These were called mansardes, the attic chambers, named after the architect Mansart, who designed the palace's soaring roof lines. Beautiful from the outside, miserable from within. In these spaces, dozens of servants lived crammed together, their beds little more than straw pallets shoved against peeling plaster. If you were especially fortunate, you might have access to a single shared chamber pot. If not, there was always the window. Let's just say Versailles was not built for sanitation, but it was absolutely built for spectacle. You see, the gold you think of, the gold leaf on the doors, the elaborate frame of a mirror, the delicate filigree that caught candlelight, it wasn't decorative. It was declarative. It screamed power. It muttered ownership. It laughed at anyone who walked by in linen. And that was you. You with your calloused hands. You with your patched apron and aching knees. You who spent hours polishing a single gilded armrest with rags made from the Queen's discarded chemises. Gold was everywhere. It was on the walls, the ceilings, the carriages, the shoes. Even the balustrades were touched with it. But your hands? They were stained only with wax and vinegar. And not the good kind. There's something cruelly poetic about Versailles. The closer you got to beauty, the less of it you were allowed to possess. Servants were instructed not to speak unless spoken to, not to look nobles in the eye, not to turn their back on the king, but also not to walk ahead of him, which meant, in practice, that your entire job was to exist in a sort of perfect, invisible orbit, always useful, never seen. Now let's talk about the servants' uniforms. Because even your clothing reminded you daily, this is not your world. No silk, no embroidery, no color. Your dress was usually brown or gray, sometimes black if you were in mourning. And frankly, most were. Mourning the loss of sleep, dignity, or basic cartilage in their knees. Unlike the nobles, whose wardrobes were changed 5 times a day for ceremonial reasons and fashion emergencies, you had one uniform. 2, if your mistress was unusually generous or unusually embarrassed by your scent. These garments were scratchy, simple, and designed with precisely one thing in mind: to keep you from looking even vaguely interesting. No ruffles, no shine, no room to express anything other than, I am replaceable. And of course, there was the dust. Versailles may have sparkled, but only because hundreds of servants swept, wiped, and scraped behind the scenes. Feather dusters were a luxury. Most used bundled rags, soaked in vinegar or urinetto clean gilded carvings, without stripping the delicate leafing. It was exhausting work, not just physically but mentally. Imagine being surrounded by art, architecture, and gold, so radiant it could blind you by candlelight. and knowing that if your cloth slipped, if you scratched something by mistake, you could be dismissed that very day. Not with severance, not with gratitude, but with a nod and a closed door behind you. Some servants tried to find joy in small things. A sliver of honeyed tart left over from a nobleman's tray. A warm breeze drifting in through a linen closet. A moment, late at night, when no one was watching, and you could sit just for a moment on the edge of a velvet chair. Not fully, not comfortably, just a corner. Just long enough to pretend you were part of this palace, and not merely trapped inside it. And yet, even these moments came at a risk. Servants were constantly surveilled by each other, by their superiors, by any noble who happened to pass by and felt bored enough to supervise. The phrase, "caught sitting," was not just a reprimand. It could be a career-ending offense. You were here to serve, not to rest. To observe, not to absorb. To clean the mirror, not to see yourself in it. Let's take a moment now and imagine one of those mirrors. The Hall of Mirrors, perhaps. That long corridor of light and majesty, where kings walked with foreign dignitaries and mistresses floated by in clouds of perfume. Each panel was hand-polished. Each chandelier had to be cleaned with vinegar and cotton wool. Each candle replaced. Each wax strip scraped gently from the floor. And who did that work? You, with your aching back. You, bent over a ladder made of splinters. You, careful not to exhale too hard in case your breath fogged the very glass you were meant to vanish behind. Because if someone noticed your reflection, you'd already failed. Even your name could be taken from you. Many high-ranking nobles referred to servants not by name, but by title or task. Chambermaid, linen girl, boot boy, salt carrier. Some masters never learned their servants' names. Others replaced them so quickly, it wasn't worth the effort. It was possible to be born, live, and die within Versailles, without anyone ever calling you anything but that one. Of course, there were exceptions. A few servants, very few, rose in rank. The valet de chambre who became a trusted confidant. The lady's maid who heard the wrong secret at the right time. The kitchen boy whose pastries won the favor of a duchess with a sweet tooth and powerful friends. But these were lottery tickets, and the odds were cruel. For most, there was no rise. Just repetition. Just the same hallways. The same tasks. The same gold walls that never looked back. By midnight, when the palace finally dimmed, and the courtiers retired to their salons or scandals, you were still not done. Late shifts included extinguishing candles, sweeping hallways again, resetting furniture, checking fireplaces for live embers, and preparing water for morning washing. And then, if you were lucky, very lucky, you could crawl up to your mansard and try not to cough too loudly. Because someone important might be sleeping 2 floors below, and the sound of your lungs was considered disruptive. So yes, Versailles was golden. Golden ceilings, golden chairs, golden wigs. But not for you. For you, it was splinters, starch, silence. Your world was linen napkins you never wiped your face with, gilded balustrades you never leaned on, mirrors that erased you. And the cruelest irony of all, you made it beautiful, but you were never allowed to belong. Imagine this. You're walking down the most famous hallway in Europe, the Hall of Mirrors, 78 meters of light, reflection, and calculated magnificence. 17 grand windows line one wall, casting daylight across 357 mirrors on the other. Crystal chandeliers drip from the ceiling like frozen jewels, and the floor, polished within an inch of its life, glows with warm candlelight by night. It's everything they say it is. Golden, glorious, designed to dazzle. And yet, as you cross the center, somewhere between a gilded door and a marble column, you catch the faint but undeniable scent of yesterday's cabbage. And then, something worse. It smells like sweat, and boots, and someone's forgotten dinner, left under a stairwell to ferment. Congratulations. You've arrived at Versailles. This was the contradiction of the Sun King's palace. Every surface gleamed. Every corridor whispered opulence. And yet, nothing could quite mask the underlying human mess of it all. You see, Versailles was not a museum. It was not a movie set, frozen in time. It was alive. And like anything alive, it sweated. It smelled. It creaked. It reeked of fish stew and unwashed wigs, of perfume attempting a noble duel with chamber pots, of wax, whetstone, and the faint tang of disappointment. Let's start with the kitchens, because while the nobles feasted above, someone had to cook. The royal kitchens were vast, cavernous, and constantly on fire. Not metaphorically, literally. Wood-burning ovens raged all day, boiling pots steamed up low ceilings, and ovens belched out bread, roasted pigeons, and the occasional near-death experience. Servants there worked in shifts that blurred into each other. A cook might start before sunrise and not leave until midnight. You didn't get breaks. You got burned. And the food? Well, it was divine. At least, when it reached the royal table. But not all food made it to a plate, especially not yours. Leftovers weren't wasted. Versailles wasn't that foolish. But they were stratified, like everything else. The king's untouched roast might go to the upper servants, a slightly gnawed pheasant to the lower ones. The kitchen maids, meanwhile, had to fight for crusts and gravy skins. Sometimes, a well-liked scullery girl would be gifted a spoonful of brandy-soaked pears, but only if the footman wasn't watching. Mostly, you ate cold porridge, old bread, and whatever stew was still bubbling from 3 meals ago. This is why the hallways smelled like onions by mid-morning. And let's not forget the pipes, or rather, the lack of them. Versailles was built before modern plumbing, but after the invention of the human nose, which made for a very unfortunate overlap. Waste from chamber pots was supposed to be collected and removed discreetly, but in a palace with over 2,000 residents on busy days, systems broke quickly. Some rooms had special closets with holes, early toilets, if you will. The contents were meant to drop into buckets in the floors below, except those buckets sometimes overflowed, or didn't get emptied, or were forgotten entirely during royal processions. It was not uncommon for nobles to stroll past the Hall of Mirrors and step delicately over a puddle of something that should not be indoors. The air inside Versailles was a battleground, perfume versus people. Nobles doused themselves in ambergris, rose oil, orange blossom, civet. The more layers, the better. Why? Because bathing, actual bathing, was rare. Yes, there were tubs. Yes, the king had attendants to sponge him, but most residents of Versailles went days, weeks, even months without full-body washing. Water was thought to weaken the skin, so instead, they powdered, they perfumed, They powdered again, and then walked briskly down hallways in thick velvet and brocade, leaving a trail of florals, musk, and something that used to be meat. For servants, there was no perfume, just sweat, and soap if you could steal it. Most relied on linen undergarments, which they washed as often as they could, hoping to trap odors before they reached the surface. But with limited access to hot water and no time for self-care, most just endured. By midday, the palace air was a rich tapestry of scent, layers of it, perfume on top, people beneath, something rotting quietly in a stairwell as the bass note. And somehow, Versailles pretended not to notice. Even the great Hall of Mirrors, Versailles' crown jewel, couldn't quite escape the atmosphere. Those mirrors, so famously reflective, had to be cleaned constantly. Wax from chandeliers would splatter them. Soot from torches left streaks. And on particularly humid days, the smell of mildew clung to the edges of the window frames. Servants had to polish every panel by hand, using cloths dipped in vinegar and water, or in more desperate moments, spit. There are reports of entire teams working through the night to prepare the room for a morning event. No sleep, no thanks, just silence, bruised knees, and aching shoulders. Meanwhile, above all this, the nobility danced, masked balls, evening receptions, lavish feasts under candlelight and painted ceilings. Their laughter echoed through halls where, just hours before, a maid had collapsed from heat stroke while trying to lift a bucket of coals. Their silk slippers brushed against marble tiles, scrubbed by hands so raw they bled through the rag. But that was the illusion Versailles maintained. It was meant to feel otherworldly, a palace that shimmered with grace, a king who glowed with divine right, a world so perfect it didn't sweat, bleed, or stink. Except it did, constantly. There's something almost tragic about the servants who worked in those mirrored halls, because every day they were surrounded by beauty, but not for them. They carried trays of crystal glasses they would never drink from. They folded napkins embroidered with coats of arms that would never be theirs. They passed through light, but cast no reflection. Even the mirrors seemed to know who counted. And still, despite all the odor and rot, the royal family insisted on ceremony. The illusion had to hold. The mirrors had to shine. The fountains had to flow. The boots had to sparkle. It didn't matter that the stable stank, that the laundry room flooded in winter, that rats danced through the attics like tiny powdered courtiers. As long as the king's guests never saw it, it didn't exist. Late at night, when the candles were finally snuffed and the courtiers drifted off to scandal or sleep, the hall of mirrors emptied, but the smell lingered, soft, faint, human, a blend of candle smoke, oiled wood, stewed meat, perfume, sweat, and dust. One maid, in a letter to her sister, wrote, "When I pass through the hall at midnight, I hold my breath, not because of the smell, though it is there, but because I want to know what it feels like to float." She never explained what that meant, but you can imagine a moment where, alone in that grand room, you almost believe it was built for you, until the door creaks, and you're reminded that you are still in your apron, still holding a broom, still part of the smell, not the spectacle. So yes, Versailles was magnificent, a palace of light, of mirrors, of gold and myth. But beneath it all, there was stew, there was sweat, there was soot and waste and wax, and someone, always someone, trying to scrub it all away before morning. Somewhere beyond the hall of mirrors, past the rustle of silk skirts and the soft clink of porcelain, a door opens. Quietly, not with grandeur, but with duty. And into the perfumed shadows of a noblewoman's bedroom steps the most delicate weapon in the palace, her chambermaid. She enters like a whisper, dressed in plain cloth, but carrying within her hands the power to destroy an outfit, a hairstyle, or a reputation. Because in Versailles, beauty was not just vanity. It was armor. It was language. It was survival. And the person responsible for crafting that armor? You. Let's talk about the femme de chambre. She was the woman who dressed Madame, brushed her hair, tightened her stays, selected her earrings, and, crucially, heard everything. She saw her mistress bare, both physically and emotionally, watched her cry after a failed flirtation, listened as she rehearsed the perfect cutting remark to deliver over soup, and occasionally, if the mood was right, held her hair while she vomited from nerves before a royal ball. It was an intimate position, and a dangerous one. At court, proximity to power was power. Even if you wore linen instead of lace, even if you stood in the corner instead of at the table, the simple fact that you knew things, real things, meant you mattered. And that made other people nervous. Other maids might envy you. Lords might try to bribe you. Your own mistress might begin to resent you, just a little, if you tied her corset too tightly on a bad morning. Because when you're the one fastening the laces, you hold a kind of quiet revenge in your fingers. Chambermaids at Versailles were ranked. At the very top, the femmes de chambre ordinaires. These were senior attendants, sometimes from noble backgrounds themselves. They oversaw the wardrobe, managed inventory, arranged appointments, and if they were clever, they gathered influence like pins on a cushion. Below them were the junior maids, tasked with cleaning, folding, fetching. Their work was invisible unless it was late. But regardless of rank, all of them shared one great challenge. Madame. Let's meet her. Madame, whoever she might be, was a noblewoman of Versailles. She could be a duchess, a marquise, or a royal cousin, twice removed, and frequently reminded. She changed her outfit up to 5 times a day and expected you to know not just which dress, but why. The politics of pink versus pale blue, which wig made her look more innocent, which jewel reminded the Dauphine of her cousin's lost inheritance. Fashion was war, and you were her general. But here's the twist. The longer you served her, the more you began to mirror her. You picked up her phrases, adopted her posture, understood when to roll your eyes or gasp in horror. You became, in a quiet way, her shadow, and that was dangerous. Because Versailles was a world built on hierarchy, and shadows weren't supposed to shine. The more clever you were, the more helpful, the more you risked stepping too far into her light. And then came the whispers. Have you seen how she speaks to the steward? She's getting ideas. She asked for rosewater for herself. Sometimes it didn't take much. A borrowed ribbon, a compliment from the wrong duke, a smile that lingered half a second too long. And just like that, you went from trusted chambermaid to suspected rival. Some mistresses were kind. They confided in their maids, left them tokens, even helped them marry well. But kindness at Versailles was rarely permanent. because there were other women, other chambermaids who played the game better. Women who sabotaged wardrobes, who swapped hairpins at the last minute, who whispered to Madame that her last chambermaid had been seen loitering near the Comte's door. Women who could feign loyalty with one hand while tying a disastrous knot with the other. One report from the time tells of a lady's maid who secretly added ash to her mistress's face powder. Just a pinch, enough to dull her glow at a crucial reception. Another hid the matching glove of a prized ensemble, ensuring her mistress appeared late, flustered, and unevenly dressed before the queen. These were not crimes. They were strategies. And no one ever accused a chambermaid out loud. They simply sent her away, quietly, permanently, because that was the other side of the mirror. Your intimacy with your mistress gave you influence, but it also made you dangerous. She knew it. You knew it. And everyone else suspected it. So you had to walk a tightrope. Helpful, but not too clever. Loyal, but not too familiar. Visible, but only just. And all while lacing corsets, managing gowns, and remembering which fan was for Thursdays. The real heartbreak came when affection turned. Some ladies adored their chambermaids, shared secrets with them, even relied on their emotional support when Versailles became too cruel. But that kind of closeness was always temporary. One wrong move, one too frank opinion, one blush when a footman complimented you, and the wall came back up. You were not friends. You were staff, and your borrowed warmth was not yours to keep. Still, many chambermaids endured, because where else could a woman rise? Outside the palace, options were few. Farm work, laundry, marriage to a man who smelled like turnips and made jokes about chamber pots. But inside Versailles, there was a kind of strange, shimmering possibility. If you lasted long enough, if you earned trust, kept quiet, and knew when to look away, you might receive a pension, a dowry, a quiet retirement to a small apartment near Paris where you could spend your final days embroidering linens no one would ever wrinkle. But those were rare. Most chambermaids left quietly, disgraced, dismissed, or simply replaced by someone younger with steadier hands and fewer opinions. They carried their knowledge with them of powders and poisons, of lovers and letters, of what Madame looked like without her rouge, and what she whispered in her sleep. And they never told, because Versailles may have ruined them, but it also taught them how to hold a secret like a blade. So next time you think of palace intrigue, don't picture the nobles. Picture the women tying their sleeves. The ones who saw every tear, every scar, every cruel smile behind the fan. They were not just dressing their mistresses. They were dressing history and surviving it. One pin, one comb, one unspoken rivalry at a time. If the Palace of Versailles had a bloodstream, its heart would have been the king's bedroom, and its whispers? The murmured instructions of his valets. They moved like shadows, dressed in soft wool and perfect silence, not born noble, but far from ordinary. Because in this world, if the chambermaid knew your secrets, the valet could end your career or your life. The valet de chambre was not just a servant. He was a witness to dressing, to illness, to power at its most intimate and fragile. He touched the king before any noble did. He knew the state of His Majesty's digestion, his moods, his moles, He selected the wig. He fastened the garters. He handed the royal undershirt carefully warmed in winter by the fire. In a place obsessed with hierarchy, where lineage determined everything, a valet could undo it all with a single, well-timed murmur. There were several valets, of course, each with their own titles and stations. But the most trusted, the premier valet de chambre, was always close, always listening, always indispensable. He managed access to the king, and that meant access to favors, positions, pensions. If you wanted to catch the monarch in a good mood, you needed the valet's blessing, or at least his cooperation. So nobles courted the valets, invited them to dinners, slipped coins into their pockets, asked how His Majesty had slept, hoping the answer would travel back up the ladder. The valets, for their part, were careful. Too much friendliness with one faction could earn you the suspicion of another. Too much information offered might make you disposable. So the best valets mastered neutrality, soft voices, calm eyes, and an uncanny ability to pretend they didn't understand what had just been said, even when it was treason, even when it was love. Being the king's valet meant you saw everything: warts, weeping fits, mistresses sneaking out at dawn. You stood behind the monarch during morning receptions, ready with a handkerchief or a cough to distract from awkward silences. You walked a step behind him on evening strolls, pretending not to notice when his gait faltered from gout or grief. You were there when he whispered about foreign ambassadors, when he sighed over court betrayal, when he asked whether the blue waistcoat or the gray made him seem more invincible. And you gave your answer, gently, tactfully, knowing that every word was being measured. There was power in that intimacy, but it was also a trap. You were always on edge. One misstep, one wrong glance, one moment of hesitation, and you could lose everything. Because kings don't like to be reminded that they are human, and no one knew the king's humanness more than his valet. Let's paint a moment. It's 8:15 a.m. The king is nearly ready to rise. The lever ceremony will begin in 15 minutes. You, the valet, enter the room with the mourning robe. You help him sit up, offer a damp cloth for his face. You murmur, "The room is warm today, Your Majesty." He nods. That nod may seem unimportant, but from it, you now know. He slept poorly. The new ambassador should not be announced today. The powdered wig should be lighter, and the Comte de So-and-so should not try to speak during the morning walk. You leave the room and relay none of this directly, but your subtle corrections, the shift in wardrobe, the tone of voice you advise for the first minister, shape the morning, and no one outside the room knows it. This was the brilliance of valet politics. Invisible influence, soft control, not through force, but through fabric, through timing, through the art of knowing when to speak and when to whisper. Some valets became legends in their own right. Alexandre Bontemps, for example, served Louis XIV for decades. He managed not just the king's clothing, but entire aspects of royal security and messaging. He was so trusted, he handled the monarch's personal correspondence and oversaw key elements of the court's movements. And yet, he remained technically just a servant. No title, no land, just proximity. And in Versailles, that was worth more than a dukedom. But there were dangers too. Valets were blamed when the king stumbled in public. If his coat wasn't fastened right, if his cough sounded worse than usual, someone asked why the valet didn't notice. If a secret leaked, if a mistress complained, if the queen looked cross, it must have started with the man closest to the chamber door. Valets had no room for mistakes. They were too visible, and yet had no protection. One accusation could end them, and there would be no hearing, no noble defense. Just a carriage, a quiet dismissal, and a new valet trained to speak less. Even among servants, valets occupied a strange place. They were not quite equal to the nobility they dressed, but they were elevated above the scullery boys and boot polishers. Other servants envied their access, but also distrusted them. It was said that valets never truly belonged, not to the aristocracy, and not to the servant world either. They lived between, in a liminal corridor, polished and polite, but alone. Still, many valets dreamed of advancement, of earning a pension, of marrying well, of being remembered. But the job offered few legacies, no portraits, no titles, just stories, whispered long after they were gone, about the man who once buttoned the king's cuffs, and may or may not have convinced him to declare war on Spain. It is a strange thing to hold that much power and still sleep in a room the size of a pantry, to serve the most powerful man in Europe and not have permission to sit until dismissed, to hear things that could ruin lives and carry them in silence, like a stone inside your chest. But some valets learned to turn that stone into leverage. They wrote letters, made introductions, helped cousins get positions, built quiet networks. Because if the nobles fought with swords and marriages, valets fought with information. They could lift a servant's career or end a noble's hopes with a comment like, "His Majesty seemed displeased this morning," even if the king had simply stubbed his toe. And so the saying went. Before the king speaks, the valet whispers, and everyone listens, even if they pretend not to. So when you picture the Sun King, glistening in brocade, surrounded by dukes and cardinals, remember, someone handed him that coat. Someone knew he hated the way it bunched at the shoulder. Someone reminded him not to smile at the ambassador from Sweden. And someone, probably barefoot and exhausted, stood just behind the curtain and watched it all unfold, quietly, carefully, with his job folded in the pocket of a waistcoat he didn't own. The first thing you learn when working at Versailles is that nothing belongs to you. Not the furniture, not the warmth from the fire, not even the space beneath your own feet. You exist to serve, to clean, to polish, but never, ever to rest. Let's begin with a throne, an actual gilded throne, carved from wood, layered with gold leaf, upholstered in brocade, and reserved for one man alone, Louis XIV, the Sun King. You could spend 2 hours each day dusting it, wiping it gently with a lamb's wool cloth, kneeling so as not to offend the cushion with the shadow of your breath. And still, if you so much as brushed it with your sleeve, you might be punished. Because this was the order of things. Even the tools you used had more permission to touch power than you did. Versailles was not just a palace. It was an ecosystem of upkeep. Over 2,000 rooms, dozens of salons, staircases, galleries, and corridors. And each one had to gleam, daily, without exception. The marble floors, the parquet patterns, the chandeliers, the mirrors, the wood paneling, all of it cleaned by hand. No machines, no shortcuts, just muscle, cloth, vinegar, and an aching spine. Most of the labor fell to the lower servants, the ones without names in the records, the ones who rose before dawn and ended their day after midnight. They were called scrubbers, polishers, haulers, waxers. Not glamorous titles, but absolutely necessary. If Versailles was a machine of spectacle, these were its gears, turning silently, always in motion, never noticed until they broke. Let's talk about the floors. The palace floors were elaborate, especially in royal apartments and ceremonial spaces. Intricate parquet, polished marble, even mosaic tiles in some places. Every morning they were swept, scrubbed, and buffed. Soap was a luxury, so workers used water, vinegar, and sometimes sand or lye. Hands bled, knees cracked, sponges dissolved in buckets that turned black by sunrise. There were no gloves, only rags, and the hope that no noble passed by while you were still drying the surface. Because if they slipped, you would be blamed, even if you had warned them. Waxing the floors was a particular torment. First came the scraping, removing the old wax layer without damaging the wood. Then melted wax was applied, hot, sticky, and often spilled. Then came the buffing. You had to kneel with thick cloths tied to your hands, pushing and rubbing the wax until the floor glowed. No one saw you do it, but everyone admired the result, especially when they glided over it, in slippers that cost more than your annual wage. Now imagine the chandeliers. Hundreds of them. Crystal, glass, gold trimmed. They hung from ceilings 40 feet high. To clean them, you had to balance on ladders made of old wood, sometimes brought in pieces and assembled on the spot. You climbed while holding a cloth between your teeth, your hands full of vinegar-soaked rags, your back screaming with each step. One misstep, one cracked crystal, and your pay could be docked for a month, and no one would defend you, because chandeliers mattered more than bones. Then there were the fireplaces. You cleaned them in the morning, before they were lit, after they burned all night. Ash clung to your arms, your face, your lungs. Your eyes stung from smoke, and still you scrubbed the hearth until it looked untouched. No one asked if you had eaten. No one cared if your sleeves were torn. You blended into the soot, just another fixture of the room, like the poker or the tongs, only less valuable. Let us not forget the endless hauling. Water had to be carried by hand. Buckets filled at fountains or pumps, then dragged up staircases that twisted like a punishment. The palace had no central plumbing, so servants were constantly in motion, fetching water for washing, drinking, cleaning, bathing. Some did nothing else. All day, up and down, the wood cutting into their shoulders, the weight soaking their clothes through before breakfast. They developed stooped backs, calloused fingers, swollen knees, and they were 17 years old, sometimes younger. Linen was another burden. The palace consumed cloth like firewood. Napkins, towels, undergarments, sheets, curtains, all had to be laundered, which meant boiling, scrubbing, beating, drying, folding, by hand, in cold water. In winter, you worked until your knuckles cracked. Then you rubbed vinegar on them and kept going. No one was impressed by your neat stacks. They only noticed when they were late, or wrinkled, or slightly damp. Then they shouted, and you apologized and kept folding, eyes down. Most heartbreaking of all were the chairs. Beautiful chairs, with velvet cushions, painted frames, hand-carved legs. They were everywhere, lining hallways, flanking fireplaces, clustered in salons. But you were not allowed to sit. You could carry them, dust them, straighten them for events. But if you rested on one, just for a moment, just to stop your feet from shaking, you might be dismissed. It happened more than once. Servants caught sitting were seen as lazy, as ungrateful, as forgetting their place, even if that place was barely within the room. And then came the events: balls, dinners, ambassador receptions, royal birthdays. Everything had to sparkle. Every mirror, candle holder, floor tile, spoon, curtain, and you, already exhausted from your regular duties, were now part of the spectacle machine, moving furniture, lighting thousands of candles, placing crystal at exact angles, ironing cloth with heated pans from the kitchen, and you could not be seen. If someone noticed you in the background, you had failed. Because servants were not part of the performance, they made it possible, but they were never part of it. When the guests finally left, drunk on wine and compliments, you cleaned again. All of it. Glassware, floors, spilled sauces, footprints, wax puddles. It might take until sunrise. And when the nobles rose late the next morning, complaining of headaches and misfolded lace, you were already back on your knees, preparing for the next event. And if someone asked why you looked tired, you smiled and said nothing. There were no medals for the cleanest floor, no titles for the quietest work, no pensions for the most faithful dusting. You labored every day inside a palace you could never inhabit. And when your back finally gave out, or your hands began to tremble too much to hold a cloth, you were replaced by someone younger, someone cheaper, someone who did not yet smell like vinegar and despair. And yet, every day, the palace shone because you made it shine, because you polished that throne and never sat on it. It is a strange thing to call a job an honor when it involves catching someone else's waist before it hits the floor. But this was Versailles, where the bizarre became noble and dignity had a very specific smell. Tonight, we explore a position of rare intimacy and extraordinary humiliation, a task so delicate it was reserved only for the most trusted of nobles, a duty both sacred and stomach-turning, holding the king's chamber pot. Yes, you heard that right. Let us begin at the porcelain pedestal itself, the royal chaise percée, a chair with a hole in the middle, fitted with a porcelain bowl below, sometimes simple, sometimes gilded, occasionally upholstered, but always personal and always ready. Versailles, for all its splendor, had no true plumbing, no toilets as we understand them, only chamber pots, and lots of them. Nearly every room had one tucked discreetly behind a curtain or beneath a wooden seat. Even in the Hall of Mirrors, there were hidden nooks, because nature waits for no monarchy. But the king's needs were handled with ceremony. The act of relieving oneself was not private, at least not for Louis XIV. He rose each morning and was assisted through a highly choreographed routine. And when it came time to sit on that chair, A servant would be there to assist, to steady, and to retrieve. This person was not just a servant. He was often a noble, sometimes a duke, sometimes a marquis, because it was not simply a bodily function, it was an opportunity. To be near the king, to show loyalty, to hold a porcelain bowl full of royal deposits and smile politely. The title for this dignified role? The Grand Chamberlain, or more specifically, the official in charge of the royal stool. The French word for it was valet de garde-robe, but informally, many just called it what it was. The man with the pot. This was not satire. It was protocol. The logic was deeply Versailles. The closer you were to the king's body, the more powerful you were. To touch his sleeve was meaningful. To carry his nightgown, significant. To assist him in the most vulnerable of human acts, that meant you were trusted. And if the king trusted you with his chamber pot, surely he could trust you with matters of state. And so, noblemen jostled for this position, not because they longed for the contents of the pot, but because they longed for the king's attention. While His Majesty sat, the appointed courtier stood nearby, ready to pass the linen cloth, offer a hand to rise, or perhaps engage in a quiet conversation about who should receive the next provincial governorship, because Versailles was a place where even bowel movements had political implications. Of course, not every moment was so glamorous. There were smells. There were sounds. There were awkward silences. And worse, awkward noises pretending to be silences. And the poor soul holding the vessel had to maintain perfect decorum. Eyes lowered, face neutral, breathing shallow. It was a test of loyalty, poise, and the ability to pretend that everything was perfectly normal. Because at Versailles, it was. Now, let us descend just slightly to the world of chamber pots across the palace. Not just for kings, but for everyone. Ladies, nobles, courtiers, and even guests relied on portable pots. Public restrooms were non-existent, and though there were private closets, they were often occupied or far away, so chamber pots were tucked everywhere, under beds, inside cabinets, behind screens, and someone had to carry them out. Enter the porteurs de chaise, the pot bearers. They worked in shifts, usually young men, quick-footed and light of stomach. Their job was to circulate through the palace, retrieving used chamber pots and disposing of the contents in outdoor cesspits or buried trenches. The job was messy, thankless, and necessary. And it was done daily, quietly, always behind the scenes. Unless something went wrong, there are records of chamber pot accidents. A spill in the Queen's antechamber. A cracked porcelain bowl in the Dauphin's nursery. A pot mistaken for a vase by a visiting dignitary. Each incident caused scandal, and someone lost their position. Because even in waste, presentation mattered. Then came the toilette. Not the modern kind, but the ceremony of dressing. It included perfumes, hair, powder, clothing, and yes, a morning visit to the chamber pot. Servants would gather the water, warm the linen, present the scented hand towels. There might be rose water or orange blossom, if the person in question was high-ranking. If not, you received cold water and a quick knock at the door. But the hierarchy was clear. The chamber pot was a social mirror. Some used porcelain, others tin. Some had dedicated attendants. Others carried their own waste down the stairs. For female servants, The work was equally intimate. Ladies' maids assisted their mistresses in everything from hairstyling to monthly bleeding. And yes, this included chamber pot maintenance. They would carry out the waste, wash the vessel, dry it, and place it discreetly beneath the bed. It was a part of life. Never discussed, always done. There were no masks, no perfumes, just practice and silence. And maybe, if you were lucky, a cracked window. For the king, however, things were different. His pot was cleaned with special cloths, dried in the sun, inspected for damage, and replaced frequently, because even a crack in the porcelain could raise eyebrows. And everything in Versailles, even the king's digestion, had symbolic weight. There is a strange kind of intimacy in all this. To serve someone so personally, so physically, and yet remain unacknowledged. To witness what no one else sees. To carry the worst of someone so they may present their best and never speak of it again. Some servants wrote of these moments long after they had left. Letters to cousins, describing how the king's pot once had gold leaf. Memoirs that hinted at awkward moments with nervous duchesses. A note from a dismissed valet who claimed the king's bowels were more reliable than his ministers. We will never know what was true, but the pattern remains. Where there is power, there is waste. And where there is waste, there is someone else holding it. So yes, to hold the royal chamber pot was a position of strange prestige. You stood near the throne. Not the marble one, but the other one. You bore witness. You breathed shallow. You did not gag. You did not laugh. You bowed and exited quietly. And the next morning, you returned, bowl in hand, face serene, dignity, somehow, still intact. Take a deep breath. The year is 1703. You are standing in a marble hallway of the grandest palace in Europe. The chandeliers above are blazing. The tapestries flutter with the breeze of passing gowns, and the air smells like jasmine, civet, powder, burnt hair, and somewhere beneath it all, urine, because this is Versailles, a palace built on illusion, and no illusion was more delicately layered than the scent of the court. Let's begin with the surface. The perfume, it was everywhere, sprayed into gloves, poured onto lace, rubbed onto hairpieces, mixed into handkerchiefs, shoes, furniture, fans, letters, combs, and candles. The nobles were steeped in it. A walking cloud of orange blossom and musk carried across salons with every turn of the head. It wasn't just fashion, it was survival. Because behind the velvet curtains and gold walls, Versailles stank. The palace, for all its grandeur, lacked proper sanitation. There were no sewers, no plumbing, just chamber pots, hundreds of them, emptied at intervals, sometimes not often enough. Servants carried waste through hallways, dripping slightly as they went. And if the weather was warm, or the servants were tired, or the pit outside overflowed, then the smell stayed. It clung to corners. It rose up stairwells. It soaked into stone. No amount of perfume could erase it, but they tried. Perfume in Versailles was not simply worn, it was deployed. As strategy, as defense, as performance. Nobles carried pomanders, small metal orbs filled with herbs, cloves, rosemary, crushed flowers, resins, even vinegar-soaked sponges. They wore them on chains, tucked them in sleeves, pressed them to their noses when walking through certain corridors. These were not fashion accessories. They were survival tools, especially if you had to pass near the kitchens or the corridor near the Queen's lower apartments, where the chamber pot traffic tended to bottleneck. The most elaborate scents came from Grasse, the perfume capital of France, distilled from orange blossoms, roses, lavender, jasmine, mixed with animal musk, ambergris, and civet. The result was heady, overwhelming, expensive. A single vial could cost more than a servant's yearly wage. And it was layered. In the morning, something citrus, light, awakening. Afternoon, floral, romantic. Evening, musk, something darker, something suggestive. Not that anyone ever bathed. That is the heart of this story. Perfume existed not alongside hygiene. It existed instead of it. The nobles of Versailles bathed infrequently. Some claimed too much water weakened the skin. Others feared illness from exposure. There were sponges, yes. Occasional foot baths, scented cloths rubbed along the arms and neck. But a full soaking? Rare, suspicious, borderline scandalous. So they powdered, perfumed, layered scent upon scent until they smelled like something out of a fever dream. And they called it elegance. Servants, of course, had no such arsenal, no bottles of rosewater, no sachets of violet powder, no gloves lined with jasmine. They smelled like work, like vinegar from cleaning, like sweat from hauling, like smoke from fireplaces and stew from kitchens. Sometimes they tried to mask it, dabbing herbs behind the ears, carrying a scrap of lavender in their apron. But mostly, they accepted it, because their job was not to be smelled, it was to disappear. The palace itself had its own scent, a blend of wax, dust, stone, sweat, mildew, and rose oil. The air was heavy, never quite fresh. Windows were rarely opened in winter, and even in summer, the breeze only stirred the odors around. There were rooms that reeked of damp lace, others of forgotten food, some of too many people in too little space. The chapel, for instance, smelled like candle smoke and old velvet. The Queen's apartment, like violet and something faintly sour beneath the cushions. Even the Hall of Mirrors, that golden corridor of glory, carried a faint trace of boiled fish on certain afternoons. One visitor from Sweden wrote in his journal that Versailles was more fragrant than fragrant, but also more pungent than polite company ought to tolerate, which was his way of saying it stank. Underneath all the jasmine and civet, the human reality persisted. Because when you gather thousands of people in one place, make them wear layers, ban them from bathing, and serve them rich food twice daily, you get Versailles. Glorious, resplendent, and absolutely ripe. Yet somehow, it worked. The nobles embraced the illusion. The guests smiled through it. And the servants kept scrubbing. Because scent at Versailles was not just about covering something. It was about becoming something. You weren't supposed to smell like yourself. You were supposed to smell like your status. A duchess might wear ambergris because it was rare and lasted longest on the skin. A marquis might dab cinnamon oil into his beard. A princess might soak her gloves in orris root until they gave off a ghostly floral fog. Scent was identity, and the more complex, the better. There were occasional failures. Someone overdid the musk, and was asked to leave a salon. A footman fainted while trimming candles in a room too thick with bergamot and sweat. The king himself once complained of a duchess who smelled like an apothecary in full bloom, and yet no one suggested bathing, because to smell too clean was to admit that you had needed to clean. Better to drown the problem in powder and petals than risk smelling like effort. The perfume industry thrived. Makers experimented with new combinations. They invented perfumes for wigs, perfumes for fans, perfumes for horses. There was even perfume for letters, so your scent arrived before your words. Some nobles had scent wardrobes, different fragrances for different moods, different lovers, different enemies. There were scandalous stories of women who wore their rival's favorite perfume to confuse a shared suitor, and of men who asked their barbers to mix lavender with crushed pearls because their mistress preferred a sparkle in the air. It was absurd, but also very real, because scent was seduction, and Versailles was nothing if not a performance of desire. For the servants who worked closest to the nobility, perfume was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it made them more bearable to their masters. On the other, it clung to them after work, masking the truth of their station, making it harder to go home, to rooms that smelled of starch and cold bread. Some maids confessed in private letters that they hated the scent of jasmine, not because it was unpleasant, but because it reminded them of being invisible, of standing quietly while someone else was admired, while someone else was kissed, while someone else left the room in a fog of orange blossom, and they stayed behind to air out the linens. So yes, Versailles was fragrant, and it reeked. It reeked of power, of sweat wrapped in velvet, of ambition dusted in iris root, of rose petals on top of rot. It smelled like everything the court wanted to be, and everything it refused to admit it was. A perfume bottle with a cracked lid, a dream half masked by smoke. Beautiful, stifling, unforgettable. Dinner at Versailles was not just a meal. It was a spectacle, a ritual, a lesson in how to chew while being watched by 30 strangers and judged by 100 more. For nobles, it was an opportunity to be seen, to network, to flirt across soup bowls. But for the servants, it was something else entirely. A battlefield where one dropped fork could become a dismissal, and one too loud breath could earn you a slap. There were two kinds of dinners in the palace. The grand couvert, where the royal family dined in public, and private meals, which were smaller in scale, but no less dangerous for those serving them. Both required armies of staff, footmen, pages, waiters, cupbearers, butlers, wine pourers, and somewhere behind them, the runners, the polishers, the food carriers, the terrified boys with towels. Everyone had their place, and if they stepped 1 inch outside of it, they would be reminded, swiftly, and not always gently. Let us begin with the grand couvert. This was Versailles at its most performative. The king and queen would sit at a raised table. They ate, slowly, delicately, while the public watched. Not the entire public, of course. Only nobles, officials, and carefully selected onlookers with proper attire and adequate perfume. They stood silently, 3 rows deep, observing His Majesty consume boiled meats while discussing matters of state. It was not about the food. It was about the viewing of the food, And this meant the servers had no margin for error. You carried a plate with both hands, elbows in, back straight, eyes forward. You never interrupted. You never dropped. You never spilled. And you most certainly never spoke unless spoken to. If you were lucky, you were ignored. If not, you became part of the evening's entertainment. Because nothing made a bored duchess smile like watching a servant stumble and land face first in a bowl of eel custard. Slaps were common, not the loud, theatrical kind, but quick ones, flicks behind the ear, a palm to the side of the head, a gloved hand across the cheek, usually delivered by someone too noble to tie their own shoes, but plenty strong enough when it came to making a point. The offense? A spoon out of line, a wine bottle opened with the wrong flourish, a sneeze. God help you if you sneezed. Then there were the curtsies. Yes, servants curtsied too, and bowed, constantly. Each time you entered a room, each time you approached a noble, each time you served a dish, and often just to clear a throat. It was choreography, performed in wool, while carrying 3 pewter trays and pretending not to wobble. Some young maids practiced in private, trying to perfect the fluid drop, the subtle rise, without spilling the tureen of hot soup in their arms. Most just hoped not to trip. Speaking of soup, it was served in courses, up to 12, sometimes more. Each course required a change of cutlery, a new napkin, a different wine. This meant constant movement. Servants flowing through the room like silent rivers, dodging elbows, fans, lace cuffs, and other servants. There was no space, no time, no rest, only motion, and the fear that you had missed a signal. Because nobles never barked orders. They hinted. A raised eyebrow, a flutter of the wrist, a barely audible cough. You were expected to know what they wanted before they did. Or else. Wine was particularly fraught. Each noble had preferences. Some liked Burgundy. Others demanded Bordeaux. Some wanted it chilled. Others only drank it warmed with cloves and orange peel. You had to remember, every time, and heaven help you if you poured before a glass was emptied, or let a drip hit the lace tablecloth. That lace was imported, delicate, expensive, and unforgiving. Some nobles carried their own napkins, or brought servants from home, because palace staff were considered suspicious, too clumsy, too common. This led to tension, jealousy, rivalries, quiet sabotage. A servant might loosen the tie on another's apron, hide a knife just before service, switch 2 wine bottles, just enough to ruin a moment, never enough to prove. And in the chaos, one more body was quietly replaced. The kitchen staff worked in a different kind of hell. They prepared the meals, hundreds of plates, thousands of ingredients, everything cooked over open flames, in vast stone rooms that never cooled. There was no refrigeration, only salt and prayer. And the occasional servant passed out from heat stroke beside the bread ovens. Once prepared, the food was handed off to the serving staff, who then bore the blame if it arrived cold. There was no applause, only complaints, and the occasional thrown bone. Private dinners were just as dangerous, because proximity made you more visible, and visibility for a servant was never good. In small gatherings, you were expected to anticipate, to understand glances, to decode size. You fetched slippers, adjusted candles, uncorked wine without sound. You saw and heard everything, and remembered nothing, at least officially. Unofficially, you kept secrets about who sat too close, who touched whose knee, who whispered what after the duck course. And you never told unless it was worth your position. Some servants became favored, not for their skill, but for their silence. A footman who knew when to look away, a maid who knew not to flinch when voices rose, a waiter who placed the extra glass just in case the Queen's cousin appeared. These were small miracles, but they kept you employed, and sometimes got you promoted to a better hallway, a warmer room, a salary paid on time. Luxury, for a servant, was measured in crumbs. After the meal, the real work began. Clearing plates, scraping scraps, wiping down tables, polishing cutlery. Some dishes were broken deliberately as statements. Others were stolen, more often forgotten. The dining room returned to silence, as if nothing had happened, and you, back in the corridor, sat briefly on the stairs, holding your side, where the tray had left a bruise, just long enough to breathe, before someone shouted, and you stood, smiled, and curtsied. You might think these moments would harden the heart, but some servants found joy in the absurdity. A spilled sauce that landed perfectly on a duke's shoe, a dog sneaking under the table and stealing a roast, a noble so drunk he applauded the wine bottle. Small rebellions, brief flickers of control. You smiled privately and poured the next glass, because in Versailles, to serve was not just to labor, it was to perform, to enter the room already invisible, to move with grace while knowing you would never be thanked, to curtsy in silence, to carry plates you could never afford to eat from, to pour wine you would never taste, and to know that one wrong step could end your world. So you kept your eyes low, your tray level, your breath shallow, and hoped no one spilled their judgment on you tonight. There is a door in Versailles that tourists do not open. It is not carved. It is not gold. It is barely tall enough to stand beneath. It leads to a room the size of a closet, because it is one. And inside, once upon a time, a human being slept. Versailles had rooms for everything. For music, for mourning, for billiards, for gowns, for silence, and for spectacle, but it did not have rooms for servants, not proper ones. When you worked in the palace, you slept where you could, behind panels, in stairwells, beneath eaves, above kitchens, or, if you were especially unlucky, in the closet beside the mops. It was called the mansarde, named after the sloped roofline, where the ceilings were crooked and the winters were cruel. These were the attic rooms. They looked charming from the outside, a French silhouette in slate and symmetry. But inside, they were airless, damp, and dark. Most had no windows, just walls that dripped in the rainy season and froze in the cold. A mattress, if you had one, was straw stuffed into sackcloth. You shared it with another servant, or two, And with the mice, always the mice. There were no stoves, only blankets and breath. If you were lucky, you had a hook for your apron and a chamber pot of your own. If not, you used the hallway, quietly, quickly, and prayed no one saw, because using the wrong space, even when desperate, could get you dismissed. This is what it meant to live in a palace without being part of it. The palace itself was enormous, over 2,000 rooms, but nearly all were reserved for royalty, courtiers, or events. The servants existed between the walls, not figuratively, literally. Some staircases were hidden, built solely for staff movement, narrow, twisting, poorly lit. A wrong step could mean a broken ankle and no job, but you took them anyway, because they were the only way to reach your room without being seen. Your quarters had no lock, no privacy, no ownership. You could be moved at any time, replaced, condensed, shifted from one broom closet to another, depending on rank, favor, or the arrival of a more important servant. Sometimes noble guests brought their own staff, and suddenly your corner was needed. No warning, just a tap on the shoulder, a nod toward the hallway, and you gathered your things, which took about 30 seconds, because you own nothing. Let us pause and consider the night. After hours of scrubbing, lifting, bowing, and carrying, you climb 5 flights of stairs. No handrails, no candles, just muscle memory. You open the door. It sticks. Inside, it is already warm with the body of whoever arrived first. There is no air, just the sour sleep smell of overworked lungs and yesterday's soup in someone's hair. You collapse, not gracefully, not neatly, just fall sideways into cloth and straw. There is no room to stretch, only curl, and you sleep until someone knocks, or coughs, or dreams loudly. Then you start again. Washing was difficult. There were communal basins, sometimes in courtyards, sometimes in corners of the kitchens. Hot water was rare. Soap was precious. Privacy was non-existent. You washed fast, or not at all, and you hoped your mistress wouldn't notice, or that her perfume would cover your failure. In winter, the attic rooms froze. Breath clouded the air. Frost crept down the inside walls. Blankets stiffened. In summer, they became ovens. Heat rose from the kitchens. The slate roof baked in the sun. There were no breezes, only sweat and silence, and the faint sound of laughter 4 floors below. Because the nobles were always comfortable, someone made sure of that. That someone was you. There were stories of servants fainting in the night and being found hours later, still curled, still unpaid. There were stories of women giving birth in broom closets, too ashamed to tell, too exhausted to cry out. There were stories of men sleeping on stairwells because the hallway was cooler than their assigned corner, and being kicked awake by passing courtiers. These stories did not make it into the memoirs, but they were real. They were daily. They were Versailles, and still, some found comfort. A friend in the room beside you, who shared bread from the kitchens, a scrap of ribbon for your hair, found and folded neatly, a joke whispered before sleep, a lullaby barely hummed, because servants found each other. They had to. No one else was looking. Not all servants lived inside the palace. Some, the lowest paid, walked in from nearby towns each day. They rose before dawn, trudged miles through mud or snow, and arrived at the gates red-faced and freezing, just in time to light the fires for people who never noticed the warmth. At night, they walked back, through fog, through dark woods, through silence. No escort, no lanterns, just obligation, and the fear of being late again. Back in the palace, the noble guests had feather beds, warmed bricks, canopied ceilings. They had servants to tuck them in, to fluff their pillows, to whisper good night. The servants had none of this. They had the corner, the straw, and the hope that no one would knock at midnight with a request to fetch water from the far end of the hall, because you always rose when called, even from sleep, even from sickness. To say no was to say goodbye. Sometimes a servant rose in rank, got a better room, one with a window, or a shared stove. It was rare, and it never lasted. Favor faded. Positions shifted. Rooms were repurposed. And you found yourself again, folding your shawl, gathering your cup, and moving back to the broom closet that still smelled faintly of vinegar and smoke. The records do not remember these rooms. They do not list square footage, or number of occupants, or how many slept sitting up, because there was no space to lie down. But they were there, filled with people, living quietly, beneath the grandeur, beside the walls, inside the shadows, dreaming, perhaps, of beds with pillows, of rooms with light, of lives where they mattered, even just a little. Versailles was a stage, and every person on it a character. But the true power was not in the lines they spoke, or the titles they held, but in what they wore. To dress at court was not a private matter. It was a ritual, a strategy, a daily battle, fought in satin. But for every duchess powdered and pinned, for every marquis laced and brocaded, there were 3, 5, sometimes 10 people beneath the surface, pulling strings, tying knots, and hemming hemlines. People who were never applauded, but who knew exactly what the embroidery cost, and not just in gold thread. Let us begin in a noblewoman's chamber. It is morning. Her hair is not yet styled, her eyes still tired, but already her day has begun. Because what she wears to breakfast must suggest modesty, but also health, but also wealth, but not so much wealth that it threatens her rivals. It is a complicated message, and someone has to write it in fabric. That someone is her maid. The maid has risen hours before. She has taken the chemise from its box, smoothed it with warm stones, checked the sleeves for wear. She has laid out 3 gowns, all suitable, all freshly mended, all cleaned with care. The choice, of course, is not hers, but the preparation, all of it, every pin, every fold, every whisper of starch. It is her work, and she will not be thanked. Getting dressed took hours, not just for royalty, for anyone who mattered. There were layers, chemise, corset, petticoats, gown, overskirt, stomacher, ribbons, bows, stockings, shoes, accessories, jewels, fans, wigs, powder. Each item had a logic, a position, a meaning, and behind each one stood a servant, holding pins between her teeth, sweating silently as the bell rang for another adjustment. Men were no better. A gentleman of court might change outfits 3, 4, even 5 times a day. Morning stroll, soft coat, cravat tied low. Midday audience, silk waistcoat, embroidered breeches, shoes with buckles that caught the sun just enough. Evening dinner, velvet jacket, cane, a wig that said confidence but not arrogance. And each of these looks was laid out by a valet, pressed, perfumed, perfect. The clothes were heavy. Physically, yes. Some gowns weighed over 30 pounds, but also symbolically. They carried expectation, hope, fear. To be underdressed was dangerous. To be overdressed, foolish. To wear last year's lace, unforgivable. So each day was a performance with new costumes and silent dressers working frantically behind the curtain. The wardrobes of Versailles were enormous, rooms unto themselves. Some noble women had over 200 gowns, dozens of corsets, boxes of shoes, trunks of lace. Servants were responsible for inventory, counting, folding, repairing, tracking which shoes had been worn to which event, and which shawl was seen at which scandal. They had to remember everything, because Madame did not, and if she wore the wrong pair twice, someone would notice, and someone would suffer. It would not be Madame. Wigs were a nightmare. They required brushing, powdering, restyling. They absorbed smoke, sweat, perfume, secrets. Servants carried them like sacred objects, sometimes 3, 4 at a time, racing between rooms with stands strapped to their backs. One wrong turn, and 20 hours of labor spilled onto the floor. And you would clean it up in silence. Let us talk about cleaning. Clothes at Versailles were not thrown into tubs. They were too delicate, too valuable. Lace was soaked, not scrubbed. Silk was pressed between cloths, gently, under warm irons. Stains were treated with mixtures of vinegar, milk, chalk, even breadcrumbs. The process was long, fragile, frustrating, and it happened constantly. Because nobles spilled, they sweated. They leaned against dirty walls. And every time they did, a servant went to work. Repairing garments was another invisible art. Small tears were stitched overnight. Missing buttons replaced before anyone noticed. Shoes rebuckled. Stockings redarned. You worked by candlelight. Bent over a table, fingers pricked, eyes strained. And in the morning, you watched someone else wear the result, as if it had always been perfect, as if perfection came without hands. Sometimes servants dreamed. They touched velvet and imagined wearing it, held ribbons against their wrists, just to see the color. They borrowed gowns, briefly, after hours, not to parade, not to pretend, just to feel, to know what it meant to be looked at for something other than speed. These moments were dangerous. If caught, you were dismissed. Theft, they said. Even if the item was returned, even if it was never worn outside your own tiny room. Because touching elegance, when you were not elegant, was a kind of crime. One Versailles did not forgive. There were rules. So many rules. You could not speak unless spoken to. You could not sigh. You could not show fatigue. You could not stain. You could not step ahead. You could not outshine, even when your embroidery was finer, even when your sense of style was better, because you were there to assist, not to impress, not to matter. Sometimes a noble would compliment a servant's skill, a perfectly tied bow, a stitch so small it vanished. But the compliment meant nothing. It did not raise your wage. It did not protect you from dismissal. It was like a feather, floating, then gone, and you went back to folding, because folding never stopped. The irony was cruel. You touched beauty, but never owned it. You created elegance, but lived in rags. You ironed sleeves for people who did not know your name. You watched mirrors reflect gowns you were not allowed to wear. And you knew, if you disappeared tomorrow, someone else would hem the lace, without hesitation. And still, you did it, because Versailles needed to dazzle. And dazzle required hands. Hands that stitched, washed, pressed, pinned, hands that knew how to disappear. You were not in the portraits, not at the balls, not in the gossip, but you were there. In every fold, in every seam, in every whisper of silk across the floor. At Versailles, voices did not always speak. They leaked through keyholes, behind fans, under doors, between curtains. There were no quiet rooms, only quieter ones. And in those shadows, beneath the perfume, beyond the powdered masks, whispers reigned. Gossip was not entertainment. It was currency. And for servants, it could mean survival or ruin, sometimes both. The palace was full of mirrors, but the real reflections came from mouths. Everyone was listening. Everyone was watching. The nobleman lingering too long near the queen's chamber. The maid who left a room looking pleased. The sudden appearance of a necklace previously lost. Each moment sparked a story, and each story became a tool. If you held one, you had leverage. If you didn't, you had a problem. Servants were uniquely placed. They moved between rooms, poured wine, dressed hair, lit fires, emptied chamber pots. They were present in the most vulnerable moments, and no one noticed them, which meant they saw everything. The letters left unsealed, the silk stains too high to be food, the tearful confessions delivered to pillows not meant for crying. They heard it, they remembered it, and they traded it, quietly, carefully, because knowledge was power, but only when used correctly. There were rules to gossip. You didn't share everything. You chose your audience. You weighed the risk. Was the secret worth a coin? A favor? A promise of protection? Could it be traced back to you? If so, you said nothing. If not, you whispered. Some servants became specialists, collectors of whispers, archivists of scandal, a chambermaid who knew which noble bled each month, a valet who memorized wine preferences and bedroom arrangements, a laundry girl who handled underthings with names stitched inside, and noticed when they changed ownership. They watched, they listened, they waited, and when the moment was right, they acted. Say your brother needed a position. You knew the marquise had a habit of late-night visits to someone not her husband. So you hint, gently, to her maid, and the next week, your brother works in the kitchens. Nothing is written, nothing said aloud, just a reshuffling of silence, and a job gained. Or perhaps you're in trouble, accused of theft. You didn't do it, but no one believes you. Then you remember the footman who was seen removing wine he didn't pour. You pass that information on. Suddenly, he's gone, and your name is cleared. That's how it worked. One whisper for another, until the floor shifted beneath someone else. But it was dangerous. If you shared too much, you became a threat. Nobles did not like threats, even if you helped them, especially if you helped them. You were useful until you weren't. And then you vanished. Dismissals were sudden. A servant replaced without explanation. A name crossed out. A door locked. Sometimes the whispers never made it out. Sometimes they were intercepted. A jealous rival, an ambitious newcomer, one wrong rumor, and you were accused of stirring unrest. The irony, of course, was that unrest was constant. The nobles just preferred it tidy. There were also protectors, higher-ranking servants who shielded those they liked. A senior lady's maid might deflect blame from a junior who spoke too freely. A valet might trade one rumor to protect another. It was a balancing act. Delicate, unwritten, deadly. Some secrets were too dangerous to tell. Illegitimate children, foreign bribes, religious doubts. These were stories you kept. They burned quietly in your chest. And if you ever had to use them, you did so as a final move. Not to win, but to survive. One maid wrote, years later, that she once knew of an affair between a duchess and her footman. She told no one, until the duchess accused her of stealing earrings. In a quiet moment, the maid handed her a note. It said only, the room on Wednesday. The window was open. The earrings were found, and the maid was not spoken to again. She kept her job for 15 more years. Some servants used gossip to climb. They became indispensable. A valet who knew who was favored that week. A maid who could warn her mistress before an awkward encounter. A butler who arranged the seating just so. They were trusted, not because of loyalty, but because of knowledge. And they never let anyone forget it. But the higher you climbed, the more dangerous it became, because the nobles smiled, but watched. They needed you, until they didn't. And if you held too many secrets, you became one. Still, most servants played the game. Not because they were cruel, but because they had to. Versailles did not offer protection. It offered competition. And in that maze of mirrors, the only way to move was to know what others had forgotten. Gossip was a language. Its grammar unspoken, its vocabulary intimate, its punctuation the silence after a meaningful glance. Servants became fluent. They traded facts like cloth, tucked them away, unrolled them when needed. They embroidered their lives with rumor, not because they wanted to, but because no one was going to do it for them. It is easy to think of Versailles as a world of grand gestures, waltzes, duels, speeches, declarations. But more often, it was a world of small sounds. The creak of a door, the pause before a name, the whisper that traveled faster than fire. And in those sounds, a whole system of survival, built not with swords, but with syllables. So yes, there were spies in Versailles, but they did not wear cloaks. They wore aprons and smiles. They served dinner, brushed hair, lit candles, and waited, not for power, not for glory, just for the right moment, to stay one step ahead, with nothing but a whisper. The day you arrived, they told you to be quiet, to be quick, to be grateful. They did not say you would never truly leave. Not in body, perhaps you could walk away, but in mind, in soul, Versailles kept you, like a perfume clinging to skin, like wax hardened into the grain of wood, like a story you forgot how to stop telling. You began with hope. Most did. You were young. You had hands. You knew how to carry things. And you heard somewhere, from someone, that if you worked hard, if you kept your eyes down, if you stayed out of trouble, you might earn your way to comfort. Not riches, just a clean room, hot bread, a place to sleep that didn't belong to spiders. So you walked through the palace gates and gave yourself away. At first, the scale of it stunned you. Marble that stretched farther than your village. Chandeliers so large they hummed when the wind shifted. Silks, fans, wigs, titles, all spoken of in tones so casual, you thought them lies. Then the hours began. You learned that the palace rose before the sun. That water was hauled in buckets, not magic. That nobles didn't see you. Not really, unless you spilled something or forgot to bow. Then they saw you. Too much. You began to live in intervals. 5 minutes of stillness, stolen behind a door. 10 minutes of laughter, whispered with another maid. A full hour of silence, which felt like freedom. But the rest belonged to Versailles. You didn't realize how much of you had gone until someone asked your name and you answered with your title. You gave up your days. That was expected. But you also gave your habits. You stopped speaking loudly. You stopped singing while you worked. You stopped asking for things. You forgot the color of your mother's scarf. You forgot the path to the orchard back home. You remembered only the floors that needed waxing, and how the queen liked her ribbons folded, and that the comte preferred his coffee lukewarm. The palace taught you how to fade. It rewarded stillness, obedience, the art of not being noticed. If you were quiet, they trusted you. If you were swift, they liked you. If you smiled without joy, they kept you. And so you stopped dancing. Not literally, there were no dances for you, but in the soul, in the place where music used to live. Sometimes, you caught sight of yourself in a mirror, briefly, carrying trays, holding linens, polishing something that did not belong to you. You looked away, because mirrors at Versailles were for admiration, not recognition. You weren't meant to see yourself. Only them. There were days you thought of leaving. You could walk out. Take the back road through the orchard. Find a job in town. Become someone whose name was spoken kindly by a neighbor, not a mistress. But the thought passed. Because where would you go? You had been shaped to fit Versailles. You walked quietly. You flinched when spoken to. You apologized before you knew what was wrong. You belonged to the palace, and the palace did not allow refunds. You stayed. You worked. You aged. Slowly. In candlelight. Beneath stairs. In rooms where the windows did not open. Your hands curled. Your knees stiffened. Your voice grew thinner. But still, you curtsied. Still, you fetched. Still, you remembered that the Duchess disliked violets. Your dreams changed. They stopped being about freedom, or love, or even comfort. They became smaller. A day without shouting. A loaf of bread with seeds. A blanket not already used. And once, you dreamed of silence. Real silence. No bells. No footsteps. Just stillness. You woke up crying and had no idea why. There were moments of joy. A friend who waited to eat until you could join her. A footman who shared a plum stolen from a noble's tray. A letter from your sister, still safe in the country. These things glowed. Small lights in the dark corridors. Soft music in rooms too full of rules. They reminded you that you were still you. Somewhere. Under the starch. Under the silence. And then, one day, you were too tired. Your back gave out. Or your hands couldn't hold the tray steady. Or you forgot the Queen's cousin's title just once. And it was decided. You would be replaced. Not cruelly. Not loudly. Just officially. Your name removed from the list. Your room assigned to someone else. You were thanked. With a nod. And dismissed. Like dust swept from a golden frame. If you were fortunate, you were given a pension. If not, you were simply expected to leave. Some did. Others stayed, cleaning empty rooms, watching others do the job they once did, becoming part of the palace furniture, not gone, but no longer necessary. Even if you left, Versailles followed, in the way you walked, the way you addressed strangers, the way you folded your clothes. People said you were refined, graceful, disciplined. You smiled. They did not see the price. Because Versailles was not just a building, it was a system, a rhythm, a set of invisible rules etched into your bones. And once it had you, even gently, even slowly, it did not let go. You gave yourself to the palace, not in grand acts, but in small things, in every button fastened, in every plate carried, in every breath held, until one day, someone asked what you did, and you answered, "I belong to Versailles." And that was enough.